Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and the Vocal Point now. An Alberta farmer is going to jail for shooting a thief on his property. But a teen who beat a lesbian because she was gay will serve house arrest. Two high-profile sentences in our province this week. Our Wednesday crime panel is ready to weigh in. Keith Spencer is a retired criminologist, also a former warden at the Edmonton Max and executive director of the John Howard Society. Rod Gregory is a criminal trial defense lawyer with Davidson, Gregory, Daniluk. And from the Calgary Herald, crime reporter Jason Van Rassel joining us tonight. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Brian Russell Knight was sentenced Friday to 90 days in jail for chasing down and shooting a fleeing man who'd awakened him in the night trying to steal an ATV from his Bashaw area farm. The thief was sentenced to 30 days. Rod, this story is at everyone, from property owners to Premier Ed Stelmach, empathizing with the farmer.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing about the story is that he pled guilty to criminal negligence causing bodily harm. So when that happens, he and his lawyer and the prosecutor go directly into a sentence hearing. So the case wasn't about guilt or innocence necessarily. It was what was a fit and proper sentence for this type of crimes.
Because he chased the thief down. I mean, yes, this person was on a property stealing something, but he chased him down in a vehicle, got his brother and friends involved, shot him with birdshot.
Yes.
So he was treated and released, the thief.
Yes.
But it was called vigilante justice. Is the point the court's trying to make? You simply can't do that. You let him go?
I think that because it's criminal negligence, it's a more serious offense, and that's why the prosecutor probably called for a jail sentence, although it was short and sharp. So they have alternatives to 90-day terms of imprisonment. He might be able to serve it on weekends or things like that.
Which he is on weekends.
So I think it's because of the use of a weapon, and certainly in different jurisdictions they look at things differently, and maybe a jury would do something different than, you know, how the case ultimately came out.
Keith, do you agree with the ruling? And I mean, so much public opinion, you know, vigilante justice. No, the guy was on his property, he had every right.
Well, it's a fabulous case because it is so divisive. And when we look at our statistics, 70% of Canadians favor vigilantism of some kind. And the great vigilantes of our country are like people like Captain Canuck and Superman and Lamont Cranston, the Shadow. You know, they're all out there as crime fighters. In this case, there's a conviction, but in 1986 there was a Calgary case, the Kessler case, where the guy chased the bad guy, shot him from behind, killed him, was charged with second-degree murder and was acquitted. So it just reflects different time, place, and circumstance. Maybe if he hadn't pled guilty, he might, and had a trial and a jury, he might have had a different ending.
Jason, what do you think of the sentence? Because, I mean, as Keith mentioned, it is so divisive, and we've also got a federal government that brought in law to try to protect people like Farmer Knight.
Look, we have laws already that protect people who are trying to defend themselves. The criminal code does have allowances for self-defense, but what it says is that action has to be proportional to the threat you're facing. So I think really we have to look somewhere else for a poster boy for property rights than Mr. Knight, because this is a guy who chased someone off their property. Now, to show you that there are protections in the law, and they do and can work, you can look at a case here in the Calgary area in 2008 where there was a home invasion. Two guys break into somebody's home. They're trying to avenge the honor of a jilted woman by beating up her ex-boyfriend. In the middle of the attack, he's woken up out of bed. He reaches for a knife, stabs and kills one of the intruders. He didn't face any charges. You could argue that this was a guy who was truly in fear of his life, was getting the pulp beat out of him, kills somebody in the process, and he faced no charges. That case had some different facts, some different circumstances, and I would argue in that case the law worked. A 90-day sentence for this farmer, shooting somebody. When you look at it, I think there had to be some sort of deterrent. Sentences are meant to deter, but they're also meant to protect society. So we've got a 90-day sentence. it sends a message that you can't go out and do this thing, but by the same token, there's a recognition that he's probably not a threat to offend again, and he's being allowed to serve it on the weekends.
A day before Knight was sentenced, a judge ruled a 16-year-old boy who viciously assaulted Shannon Berry, a 32-year-old lesbian, an aggravated assault the judge ruled was colored by homophobia, warranted only 6 months house arrest, even though Berry's jaw was broken, her eye socket crushed, and she suffered facial nerve damage. Rod, how do Albertans come to terms with these very different results for, I'm not sure you can compare the crimes, but here you have Berry was doing nothing to provoke the attack. She wasn't stealing anything. She suffers far more damage. The teen gets house arrest. The farmer goes to jail.
Well, really, it raises a completely different issue that one person is a young offender and one's an adult. And I think in society, people are getting tired of teenagers who approach adulthood who I think are shielded from adult sentences. And that's the outcry that I think citizens would have. And so if he had been an adult, he would have received a significant term of imprisonment.
Because in fact, the defense argued jail would not help the 16-year-old client. It won't harm the farmer, so he goes behind bars. Is that the way it works?
Well, I think it might not have harmed the young offender, but it sends a message to others. I mean, this is a society that's trying to make hate crimes of various kinds a serious issue. And
this was not ruled a hate crime. The judge
and that's
decided
another thing that bothers
close,
me. She says, oh, it's homophobia, but that homophobia was acted upon and very serious damage done. Mm-hmm. And sexual orientation is one of the big three targets for hate crime, race, religion, and... So
you question the decision not to call it a hate crime?
I question not calling it a hate crime, and I question the message that it gives to other people in the community that this guy does this, and for most people, they don't see any particular consequence.
Jason, it seems most unfair to Shannon Berry.
We need to back up a moment, though, and remember that the criminal code defines hate crimes very narrowly. The definition for a hate crime is advocating genocide, inciting hatred against a particular group, or doing mischief to any kind of religious site. That didn't happen in these cases. Now, what the criminal code also does is it allows a judge to take whether a crime is motivated by hate into account in sentencing. Now, you can make an argument here. There were homophobic slurs that were exchanged back and forth between this young man and Berry's group, but ultimately it seems the judge didn't think that played into the motive behind the attack. The evidence that I read said that the judge believed that this was a momentary flash of anger and violence that led to this, and it was not something that was pre-planned. There's definitely a disturbing element of homophobia in this case, but I just don't know if the evidence was there to really make a sentencing based on this crime being motivated by hate.
Well, next, another issue, deplorable conditions for women behind bars in Alberta and throughout our nation, in fact, what a Calgary investigative reporter has uncovered. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and the Wednesday Crime Panel. Calgary Herald reporter Michelle Lang, who was killed in Afghanistan in 2009, is being remembered with investigative journalism now. The first product of the Michelle Lang Fellowship is in today's Calgary Herald. Fellowship recipient, reporter Laura Stone, has reported on deplorable condition in our women's jails and prisons. Jason, can you briefly just describe what she's saying she found?
Well, what we have, I guess, is a situation where we have a prison population, just talking about the female population, that's grown about 40% in the last 10 years, and conditions inside the prisons that haven't really caught up. Women are being housed in interview rooms and makeshift trailers that are normally used for visits, and being double bunked, triple bunked in some cases, and sometimes done so regardless of their security classification. So you have women with different needs and different threat levels being housed together, and what that's led to is an increase in violence inside these institutions. Right. Laura documented a 50% increase in incidents just in the last year. Some of those include incidents of self-harm from inmates who are hurting themselves, but generally overall an increase in violence among this prison population.
Keith, does this story bother you?
It doesn't bother me in the sense that you could have crossed out women and written in men in every one of those sentences. Jails are overcrowded. The resources are scarce. There's a lot of issues and problems. The reality is there are more and more women offenders because there's more and more women criminals. We have a convergence theory that suggests that women are behaving more and more like men in employment areas and in leisure areas and in criminal behavior too. So it's no surprise. The problem is that when these new women's institutions were conceived, the vision was the woman as a victim, sort of passive with some emotional problems. We'll put them in nice little cottages, tend to a cottage, they'll live together happily. My wife often says that if she and her 5 best friends had to be on a cruise any longer than 2 weeks, they'd kill each other. I mean, living with women is very difficult, and anyone will tell you that running a women's prison is almost impossible. So without sounding like a sexist,
well, you ran the Edmonton Max, so...
I know this story backwards and forwards, and it keeps repeating itself. And the reality is that it is true that there's an excess of women offenders, and they are a fast-growing category, and they need to build more facilities, and I think the Edmonton one is going to expand. But again, the vision of cottages and putting all kinds of different levels of women in a cottage just doesn't work. There is not enough heavy-duty psychiatric options for women offenders.
Rod, does the problems that the inmates are experiencing from just, overcrowding to dangerous assaults, violence, does that cause problems with these individuals, and then all of us have to deal with that when those inmates are released?
Well, I agree that it's a gender-neutral issue. So I don't agree with the Prime Minister when he wants to make more prisons, but we need to put fewer people in prison, but the people who are in there have to be properly housed. So they don't get access to rehabilitation, they don't get access to education, they don't get access to really anything. So the conditions are deplorable.
And we're going to put more of them in there with less resources.
There'll be more in there, and they'll be coming out exactly the same as how they went in.
Jason, this story may not be entirely new, certainly great work by the Calgary Herald, but why haven't we maybe even seen more of this? Is it just a question of access? We've got about 20 seconds for you if you care to address that.
Access to information is always difficult, but I do, in the little time I have left, want to address some of the things that Keith and Rod were saying. I really think there is a gender issue here, and I think there's a sad irony involved when we tried to reform the women's prison system a few years ago after the Prison for Women inquiry, the Alberta inquiry, and the fact that we are back in the same situation some years later, I think is a gender-specific problem, and one that deserved the attention it got in this series.
Good work. Thank you all for your comments tonight. Keith Spencer is a retired criminologist, also former assistant warden at the Edmonton Max and executive director of the John Howard Society. Rod Gregory, criminal trial defense lawyer, and from the Calgary Herald crime reporter Jason Van Rassel. Thank you all.